Hosea chapter 9 is where we're going to be here this evening, working our way through the prophecies of Hosea. Hosea 8, last week we looked at, lays out the charges that Jehovah is bringing against his people, and Hosea 9 is going to lay out the punishment that awaits them for those charges. And so without a whole lot of introduction, because I don't know if you've noticed, that it's a little bit repetitive. It's a lot of the same message. He'll say, this is what you've done, and he keeps explaining it, and he'll use a different illustration, or he'll use a different picture to help us to realize what's going on. There's some interesting themes that we're going to see here this evening, and some themes that are going to return back to earlier passages. Let's look first. We see kind of an unperceived judgment. They almost don't know what's going on at first. Look at verse 1 of chapter 9. Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy as other people, for thou hast gone a-whoring from thy God. Thou hast loved a reward upon every corn floor. The floor and the winepress shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail in her. Now this is another one of those chapters that perhaps is a good example of why people avoid the minor prophets, because the way that things are phrased, they're not the way that we would phrase it. But you'll note here that in verse 1, he talks about, for thou hast gone a-whoring from thy God. So he's returning. You remember chapters 1, 2, and 3 are all using his home life, the prophet Hosea's home life, as an example, as an illustration of a faithful God, who was pictured by Hosea, and an unfaithful wife, Gomer, who pictured Israel. And so here he kind of returns to that, this unfaithful wife. He says, thou hast gone a-whoring from thy God, thou hast loved a reward upon every corn floor. What on earth is he talking about? Well, probably what you're thinking he's talking about as you look at it. Typically, the time of harvest in this, not just in Israel, but in all cultures like this, in agrarian cultures, it was a joyous occasion. It was marked by feast and festival. The harvest time was a time when people would come in from the hills and they would help out in the harvest time. So thus it was a time when many times families were getting together and they were able to be with each other. But in the midst of this bountiful harvest that Israel is receiving, Israel, pictured here, the wife who has gone a-whoring, Israel takes the opportunity to prostitute herself on the threshing floor. That's what it's talking about, the corn floor. The place where they would beat out the grain, or sometimes they would ride over it with a wheel, and then they would thresh it, throw it up in the air, let the chaff blow away. In the midst of God's very abundant blessing, Israel took that opportunity. When God is pouring out blessing on her, Israel takes the opportunity to sin in the midst of blessing. I think the problem here, again, is kind of a recurring theme, that Israel has gotten incredibly familiar with the blessings of God and has come to feel that she's entitled to them. And we're prone to this as well. We mistake God's long-suffering mercy for his acceptance. We have this idea, well, God hasn't struck me dead yet, so I must be okay. No, but that's what Israel's doing. Israel kind of has this idea. She mistook God being long-suffering for his being tolerant and overlooking their spiritual fornication. That's what they're talking about. So to take what is pictured by a woman whoring herself out on the threshing floor, let's bring it into what it is picturing. In spite of God blessing Israel, can you think of some of the blessings of Israel that Israel had poured upon them? You think about victory in battle against overwhelming odds. You think about the harvest, as we're seeing right here. You think about protection. You think about divine provision. All of these things. And in the midst of this, while God is pouring out blessings on his chosen people, they go off and worship idols. It's the same idea as an unfaithful wife going out and committing adultery in a time of great blessing. In the very time that she should be most thankful for the material blessings of God, it's harvest time, she's whoring herself out to idols while she gathered in God's blessings. I don't know if you remember, but let me read it to you. If you want to, you can flip there, but I'll read you a couple verses from Hosea 2. It reminded me, when I was reading here, it reminded me of chapter 2, verse 8, where God says, "For she did not know that I gave her corn." Who brings in the harvest? Well, the farmer. No. God gives the harvest. Farmers get to harvest it. They get to work to bring it in, but God gives it. God says, "For she did not know that I gave her the corn and wine and oil and multiplied her silver and gold, which they prepared for Baal." Can you imagine? God gives Israel material blessings, even silver and gold. And they take the silver and gold that God blessed them with, the God, and they take it and they melt it down and make a God and worship it. Talk about insulting. That is just, it's despicable as we read it. He goes on there, he says, "Therefore will I return and take away my corn in the time thereof, and my wine in the season thereof, and will recover my wool and my flax given to cover her nakedness. Now will I discover her lewdness in the sight of her lovers, and none shall deliver her out of mine hand." God says, look, if you're going to keep taking what I give you as a blessing and using it to flagrantly spit in my face, I'm going to take it away. I'm not going to give you these blessings. Because of her pollution, because of her flagrant act of unfaithfulness, the joy will depart out of Israel. That's one of the first items of judgment. The joy will depart out of Israel. That's why he says, "Rejoice not, O Israel, for joy as other people." But it would also, not just would she lose her joy, because of her flagrant act of unfaithfulness, Israel would also come into captivity to foreign powers. And because we're in Hosea 9, we know who those powers are, or specifically who that power is. The main power who we're talking about would be Assyria. Assyria is going to come in, and they're going to bring Israel into captivity. Look at verse 3. "They shall not dwell in the Lord's land." Who? Well, the people who hoard themselves out. "They shall not dwell in the Lord's land, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean things in Assyria." Now, I'm not going to go down into the weeds on this too far, but there are some commentators who, in reading this, they believe that Egypt is being used symbolically here, that Israel won't actually go down into Egypt, but Egypt is used often to picture sin. It's possible that that's true, but we also know, if you remember from the last chapter, it talks about them going down into Egypt, which they did, because as the Assyrians came in from the north, some of the children of Israel fled towards the south and down to Egypt. So there's an element in which they did go down to Egypt. The Lord had told his people in Leviticus 25:23 that the actual land of Israel belongs to him. So when we get into this big debate that we hear all the time right now, well, who owns the land? Is it Israel's or is it the Palestinians? Well, it's God's. He said so. He said the land is mine. And he said it in those words. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. There should be no question about it. In Leviticus 18, it's one of the passages where God warns the Israelites against going after the sins of the Canaanites. It's one of those passages where God lays out in chapter 16, 17, that area, God says, if you obey me, you'll have this blessing, and this blessing, and this blessing, and this blessing. And he just lays out all these blessings. We come to chapter 18, and he lays out, if you disobey me, you're going to have this curse, and this curse, and this curse, and this curse. And he lays out all of the curses. One of the curses that he lays out is Leviticus 18:28. He says, that the land spew not you out also when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. Meaning what? If you go against my commands, if you continually rebel against me, The land will spit you out the same way it spit out the Canaanites before you. And if you look back over history, you will find multiple instances where this happened to the children of Israel. It certainly happened here to the children of Israel in the kingdom of Israel, but then it happened in 70 A.D. It has happened multiple times to them.
What is not spit out to Palestinians because they're not his children?
Well, it will. It just hasn't happened yet. Yeah, but one day it will definitely fix the problem.
They wouldn't be as what word do I use? They're not his. They're not Jewish, so they're not as offensive to him probably as his own people.
For sure, for sure. The Jews knew better. What's more? They're both crimes, but it's worse when somebody who knows better goes against the law, right? That's what Israel is doing. Hosea shows us that God meant what he said, and now he's going to make good on that threat. He's saying it in verse 3. I said I was going to cast you out of the land, and I'm going to. He says, he talks about those who go down to Egypt. They're the ones who would flee. I think it is being literal here. Deuteronomy 28:68 says, and the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again. Those who go away into Assyria, who are caught up and taken into captivity, they're going to be scattered. The point of the verse, wherever they ended up, Israel was no longer in the land. They're no longer in Israel. Maybe they're in Egypt. Maybe they're in Assyria. Maybe they went into North Africa. It doesn't matter where they went. They're not where they're supposed to be.
They're not in blessing.
They're not in the land of blessing. Absolutely. He says they shall eat unclean things in Assyria. You remember in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it's one of those verses where we see Daniel as a young man. It says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat nor with the wine which he drank. That was Daniel, who had conviction, saying, look, it doesn't matter that I'm being offered great food. I'm not going to defile myself. I won't partake of that which God says don't eat. There were very clear dietary laws laid out. But Israel here is going to eat unclean things in Assyria, which is interesting because Israel was already eating unclean things in their own land as part of the ritual worship of false gods. So they were doing it on their own, but now they're going to do it by constraint. They're going to be taken into a foreign land, and Assyria will give them the food that they eat. And it won't be kosher. It might have pork in it. It might have any number of things that the Jews were not supposed to eat. But that's part of their punishment. Part of their curse is they're going to be eating unclean things in Assyria. Look at verse 4. They shall not offer wine offerings to the Lord, neither shall they be pleasing unto him. Their sacrifice shall be unto them as the bread of mourners. All that eat thereof shall be polluted, for their bread, for their soul, shall not come into the house of the Lord. What will ye do in the solemn day, in the day of the feast of the Lord? For lo, they are gone because of destruction. Egypt shall gather them up. Memphis shall bury them. The pleasant places for their silver. Nettles shall possess them. Thorns shall be in their tabernacles. As you read through the first 5 books of the Old Testament, particularly Leviticus and Deuteronomy, if you've done it, you know how tedious it is. If nothing else, the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy teach us that God takes everything about his sacrifices seriously. God does not want you to offer what's left. He wants you to offer what's best, obviously. He doesn't want you to offer at your house. He wants you to offer at the tabernacle or eventually at the temple. God had a set and very strict prescribed method whereby you were to offer sacrifices. But Israel was guilty of trying to kind of ride the fence in worship and sacrifice. Let me explain. They're not following the manner of sacrifice prescribed by God. Rather, they would engage in pagan, idolatrous worship, and then they would attempt to worship God when their services overlapped. Let me explain what I mean. The idea would be Israel's there, and somebody says, well, we're drinking wine as part of our worship to Baal. God talks about drink offerings. Let's include him in this. We'll pour out some wine to Jehovah and he'll be happy too. How do you think that would go? You think God's pleased? No. He's insulted. What are you doing? I gave you all of this scripture and you're perverting my sacrifices. Because they refused to observe the commandments of God, when they were in the land, they would be taken out of the land. And they wouldn't be given the option, the privilege that they had of sacrificing unto the Lord in Jerusalem. That privilege that they had would suddenly be taken away. The people of Israel, it was inconvenient, sure. It was a long trip, and you had to go into another kingdom. But the children of Israel could have gone to Jerusalem to observe the feasts, sacrifices to Jehovah. But they're soon going to lose the opportunity. Any attempt to offer sacrifices to God from within Assyria would not be acceptable. He says it will be like the bread of mourners. When you offer bread to God, it's supposed to be a certain type. It's supposed to be special. It's set apart. The bread of mourners was not so. It would be common. So there's not just a loss of joy, not just a loss of her land and the ability to worship God after the order of God. Israel is also going to face, and this one is frightening. And it should put a little bit of fear into us, even as we read it. There would also be, as a means of God's judgment on them, Israel would face a loss of spiritual discernment. Look at verse 7. The days of visitation are come. The days of recompense are come. Israel shall know it. The prophet is a fool. The spiritual man is mad. For the multitude of thine iniquity and the great hatred. You see, Israel, there were prophets. There was Hosea. There was Isaiah. There were Micah. There were other prophets who were there in Israel and also in Judah. But those weren't the only, and I put it in quotes, those weren't the only prophets wandering around. There were also prophets at the same time that Hosea was walking around saying, judgment is coming. It's sure. There were other prophets who were walking around saying, everything's fine. Everything's fine. You know how we know everything's fine? Look at the blessings that God keeps giving us. Of course he's not mad. If God were upset with us, would we be having a bumper crop this year? Again, mistaking God's blessing for God's tolerance. Mistaking his mercy for his endorsement. They would say about Hosea and the other prophets of God, the prophet is a fool, the spiritual man is mad. That was how they looked at the men who were walking around speaking the truth, because nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear somebody walk up to you and say you're wrong. Nobody wants to hear someone come up to you and say, well, the nation's actually about to come under judgment. It's practically at the door. Nobody wants to hear that. Hosea does say it, though. And soon nobody's going to be able to deny it. As they're going away in chains, no one's going to be able to say that Hosea was wrong. No, they'll sadly and with tears have to admit Hosea was right. Look at verse 8. The watchman of Ephraim was with my God, but the prophet is a snare of a fowler in all his ways, and hatred in the house of his God. They have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. Therefore, he will remember their iniquities, he will visit their sins. The people had rejected the ministry of God's men, and rather they were looking for false prophets. They were looking for people who would tell them what they wanted to hear. Does this sound familiar at all? Does this sound like today? Yes. It does. The people who go and speak truth, well, they're unpopular. So people say, oh, they're bigoted, they're prejudiced, they're closed-minded. And the people who say, I'm okay, you're okay, we're all God's children, well, they have a massive following. Jesus said in Mark 6:4, a prophet is not without honor, but in his own country, and among his own kin, and in his own house. Stephen cried out to the Sanhedrin in Acts 7:52 when he was getting ready to be stoned for preaching the truth. He said to the very religious men who were condemning him, he said, which of the prophets Have not your fathers persecuted? And the answer was understood. They persecuted all of them. They put all of them to death. Paul warned Timothy in 2 Timothy 4 verse 3, speaking of, I'm convinced the time in which we live. He said, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. Meaning they'll bring in people who tell them what scratches the itch. They'll bring in people who tell them exactly what they want to hear. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. That verse 9. They have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. Gibeah was the city in Judges 19, where that city was almost completely wiped out because of their great sin. That was a city within Israel that was filled with homosexuality and all sorts of debauchery. And the rest of the tribes came and they just wiped them out. They wouldn't have it, along with almost the entire tribe of Benjamin. And here, history is repeating itself. In Hosea, Hosea says, look back. What happened to Gibeah? You remember what happened when we went against God? You remember what happened there? It's getting ready to happen, only this time God is going to use the Assyrians. He's not going to use a civil war. He's going to use an outside power. This last point second to last point that we'll look at here, another very, very tangible evidence of God's judgment upon his people would be a declining birth rate. Look at it. It's just right there on the top. And we could try to spiritualize it, but I'm convinced that's not what he means. He means exactly what it says. You remember when Israel was in Egypt before the Exodus, do you remember why they became a threat to the Egyptians? Because they were having babies. Lots of babies. To the point where they were outgrowing the Egyptians. But because this captivity was a judgment, Israel would not have that same population explosion. Israel is not going to be taken into Assyria and have lots of babies and then have an exodus out of Assyria. That's not going to repeat. Verse 10. I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your fathers as the first ripe in the fig tree at her time. But they went to Baal Peor and separated themselves unto that shame, and their abominations were according as they loved. Verse 10, God is kind of reminiscing about the relationship he had with Israel when she first came out of Egypt, when there was that newness to their relationship with God, when things were close, when things were how they should have been. But then Israel, he talks about Baal Peor. I won't go into it, but that's where Balaam, the prophet with the talking donkey, that's where he came in and taught King Balak of Moab to intermarry and bring in idolatry. Israel had such a sweet fellowship with God, such a good relationship, but then they developed a wandering eye. They worshiped Baal, participating in all of the debauchery that went along with it. Look at verse 11. As for Ephraim, their glory shall fly away like a bird, from the birth, from the womb, and from the conception. They're not going to have kids. Though they bring up their children, yet will I bereave them, that there shall not be a man left. Yea, woe also to them when I depart from them, meaning those who do have kids will lose them. Ephraim, as I saw Tyrus, is planted in a pleasant place, but Ephraim shall bring forth his children to the murderer. Give them, O Lord, what wilt thou give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breasts. Is it a coincidence, do you think, that as a nation declines into moral decadence and debauchery, that their birth rate also goes down? Can you think of any contemporary examples of this truth? The United States of America has a plummeting birth rate. Our birth rate right now is such that nations don't recover from the birth rate that we have right now. God would restrain the women from bearing children. The children who were born would be given over to those who would murder them. Again, that also sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Verse 15, all their wickedness is in Gilgal. That's where it had started. That's where Israel brought in. That's where they chose Jeroboam to be their king. That's where they, again, to put it in the illustration of a faithful husband and an unfaithful wife, that was her first step out. That was where Israel first kind of stepped out on God in the relationship. He goes on, he says, for there I hated them. For the wickedness of their doings, I will drive them out of mine house. I will love them no more. All their princes are revolters. Because of their spiritual whoredom, the land will spew them out. As it said in Leviticus 18:28, this generation, this right here is not God saying, I hate Israel now. This generation of the northern kingdom is going. They're going to be destroyed. They're going to be wiped out. Ephraim, verse 16, which is speaking of Israel, is smitten. Their root is dried up. They shall bear no fruit. Yea, though they bring forth fruit, yet will I slay even the beloved fruit of their womb. God says, you bring up your children to do the same sins that you do, so I won't allow you to have them. Who's ultimately in control of who has children? God is. And God says, I'm not going to allow you to have more children to pervert them. Lastly, there will be an expulsion. Verse 17. My God will cast them away, because they did not hearken unto him, and they shall be wanderers among the nations. Look at the difference that has come about in this chapter. If you look back at verse 1, you have Israel under the blessing of God and comfortable. So comfortable, in fact, that you've heard the old phrase that familiarity breeds contempt. Israel is so familiar with God that they've actually grown contemptuous of him. Even though they're receiving blessing, they're stepping out. They're being unfaithful to him. They're mistaking his mercy for his acceptance of her wickedness. And in verse 17, Israel is being driven from the land to wander the world as people without a country. How did this happen to Israel? How did we get to this point? How did we get here? Well, it took time. It took generations. Many generations that refused to stand up and do what was right. It took, if you read, there are Psalms where it says, and they forgot to tell their children the great things that God had done. I've given you the quote from Reagan where he says that freedom is only one generation away from extinction. Well, so is righteousness. And as the generations pass, they get further and further and further away from God. Israel did not get to this point where she's spiritually pouring herself out on the threshing floor. She did not get to this point in one generation or in 10 years. It took time. It took a willing blindness and ignorance to the message of God's faithful prophets who were crying out against their sin. Hosea is he's the first of the minor prophets, but he's not the first prophet. Israel had lots of prophets saying, hey, you need to listen. You need to listen. God's not going to let this slide. It took years of blindness. It took finding prophets who would tell them what they wanted to hear. Not only did they reject God's prophets, they said, I don't like what this guy has to say. I'm gonna go find somebody who will tell me what I want to hear. And they found him. It took compromise. It took intermarrying. And it took the slow decay of culture into idolatry and self-service. Again, I ask, does this sound familiar? The fact that there's a slow degradation. It doesn't happen overnight. You know what Israel really needed to fix all of this? They just needed a different king, right? Israel just needed somebody else in the palace. Is that what Israel needed? Did Israel just need another king? No. What Israel needed was to rid themselves of the foreign influence that had gained a foothold in their land, right? That's what they needed to deal with their immigration issues. They did have an immigration issue. Would that fix it? Somebody new in the palace and fix the problem, and would that fix it? What is the only one thing that would fix what's wrong with Israel? Personal revival. Judgment is going to come upon Israel. There's no stopping it at this point. But if you look ahead, and I would encourage you to, if you look ahead, there is still hope for individuals. Israel is going to be judged. Israel is going into captivity. Israel is going to face dark times and destruction. But there's still hope for individuals. And that's the message of Hosea. There's nothing that Israel can do and say, God, sorry. And God will say, oh, okay, everything's off. You're back on the straight and narrow. That's not going to happen. Why? Because actions have consequences. And Israel has for generations spit in the face of Almighty God, and judgment is going to come. It cannot turn aside. You remember Lo Ruhama and Lo Ami and Jezreel? All of those names of Hosea's children, they indicate there's nothing you can do to stop the judgment on the nation. The nation's going down. But can God save the individual? Not only can he wants to. Hosea is not looking for Israel, national Israel, to say, hey, let's get rid of our king. Let's do things right. He's looking for individuals who will take him seriously, who will take God seriously, and who will be the salt and the light that they should have been, not just in their own land, but to the nations of the world. The truth is the same in America. You can't break the laws of math that we have broken as a nation. You can't break the laws of common sense that we have as a nation. Our nation is in a very depraved place, culturally and societally speaking. We're in a dark place. And it doesn't, I'm not saying it doesn't matter who wins in November. I think it does have dramatic effects. But it doesn't matter, it won't fix what's wrong with America if my guy gets in or if your guy gets in. That's not going to fix it. We could close the border off tonight. That's not going to fix what's wrong with America. The only thing that's going to fix America is God's people taking God seriously and getting right with Him and being the salt and light that they need to be. So, an encouragement to you here from Hosea, kind of a dark chapter. I don't apologize for Scripture, but it's another repetition. Hey, get your act together, Israel. Individuals are the key.